Right, so tragedy, yippee, woo, exciting stuff. I know. A level, woo, it's the one good paper. So what is a tragedy? On the surface, tragedy is pretty simple. They're just sad stories that they make us feel things. They follow the descent, the fall of a character or an idea. And they really get you because they convince you that everything's gonna be okay, and then it's not okay. It all goes to pot. But they keep saying no, 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 no. It will be okay, and then it doesn't go okay. That's like dramatic irony, but more on that later. So we'll look at the beginning of tragedy. We'll look at Aristotle and classical tragedy, an Aristotelian tragedy, if you will, and that's basically what this little thing is all about. Aristotelian tragedy, which is I think AO4. I don't know genre stuff, but you can do it. It'll get you marks. Get you marks. That's what matters. So basically, everything that we know uh, about tragedy from Aristotle comes from his little book, the Poetics. It's a collection of Aristotle's lecture notes upon the ideas of tragedy and poetry, which were basically the same thing at the time. It sets out, the six elements of tragedy. It sets out the unities of time, place, and action. It states tragedy is the art of imitation. Suggests tragedy requires a fall from grace. It also actually has mentions of comedy, but the notes, like the thorough notes on comedy, have been lost to time, which is a shame. Um, so we look at tragedy as the art of imitation. Then it's imitation, mimesis. It's the idea of the perfect imitation of nature. It talks about being an active aesthetic process. And it says that imitation is given us by nature, and men are endowed with these gifts gradually, develop them, and finally create the art of poetry. Yeah, I'd just talk about how not tragedy, how Aristotle describes a tragedy as the art of imitation. Um, because, yeah, it works. And the word mimesis comes from imitator or actor, pretending. And this is the mimic symbol in Faz because, yeah. And if we look at then Aristotle's six elements of tragedy, these are really important because when you're doing your part A and you're doing your like close analysis of tragedy, this is a really good way to get into the dramatic methods, into the actual scene. So the first one is plot. Plot's pretty important. A story without a plot isn't really a story at all. Feelings and alike can only be generated with a convincing storyline. So if you have a really boring story, then it's really difficult to garner any emotions. I mean, you do see people that do manage to do this. If you look at Samuel Beckett, all of his stuff, basically nothing happens most of the time, and it's beautiful and it's sad. Waiting for Godot is the one that I've read. It's beautiful. His short stories I've read a bunch of. They're great. I really want to read both Endgame and Crap's Last Tapes, but they're all just marvelous, incredible. But they don't really have a plot. But they're also not tragedies. They're absurdists. That's an entirely different thing for a different day. It sets out the rise and falls of characters, so it allows us, to really see and understand the different characters, and that is by having other tragic techniques that are kind of structural, allows them to really work properly. Things like Hamartia and Pericotea, which of course we're going to look at later on. Then we have character. Character comes second most to plot. Generally, Aristotle suggests that tragedy is not necessarily designed to depict human personalities, but human action. It talks about the really thing that's important is not necessarily who like the traits of a person are, but the actions of a human. So it's imitating what a person would do, a person could do, not necessarily what they feel, because we're the ones that are feeling. The characters are just characters. It suggests that a tragedy must occur to those of a high social class, such as a king or god, as they have the most to lose, which creates a greater sense of grief and catharsis in an audience, because it's the audience that needs to feel things, because that's why we like a tragedy. And of course, a character should always enhance the plot. Because if you have a great plot and awful characters, it's not going to work. If you have great characters and an awful plot, it's not going to work. Now we have diction. I like diction a lot. It is the classification of sounds, word type, and even metaphors for some reason is classed as diction. The importance of diction really is clarity, and it functions to make the tragedy understandable. It's basically just looking at the words that they're using and why they're using them and how they're using them, essentially. And even things like whether it's a noun or a verb and things like that actually are kind of covered within diction. But yeah, it's a little bit iffy, but it's chill. We have reason. I love reason. Reason's great, and reason's quintessential in Othello because we get Iago, and Iago he tells us so much stuff, and so it really allows us to look at and understand what's going on through him because he gives us the reason. It allows us to understand his motives, which basically there are none. And we can link it to the Art of Rhetoric if we would like, which is another one of Aristotle's books. He, I think, directly references it in Poetics. But essentially, that's all about the art of persuasion because they're trying to persuade the audience things like ethos, logos, pathos. Being emotive, being credible, being rational. Yeah, and this therefore generates a deeper emotive connection between audience and character, and it allows the essence of the tragedy to linger within the audience rather than just sort of being like, I don't really get what's going on, but that's a little bit sad. We actually understand the things that are at play to make it sad and make us sad. Spectacle. Spectacle is attractive but is inartistic. And tragedy does not depend on spectacle. It's useful for engagement, but non-required for effect. This is the idea of looking at what's on stage. So this is really useful and important when we look at Iago's staging, say, in Act 1, Scene 3, where Iago is sort of like towards the side at the end, and then at the end he sort of comes through after everybody's leaving. It really allows us to get that sense of secrecy because spectacle is just what's on stage. So the idea that Aristotle's talking about is actually that at the time they didn't necessarily have a play for every poem. They might just have a poem, and it was like, well, you don't need a visual to understand and feel the emotions, and it's attractive but it's inartistic because it means that it relies on the individual words less. But of course we get a lot of spectacle in Othello. And then lyric poetry is most important, not for the tragedy, it's like the least important for the tragedy, but it's the most important source of pleasure. Poetic forms, meters, and ideas, and it's language made pleasurable. This is the form, this is the meter. So, it's the iambic pentameter, or when Iago goes into prose, or those moments where they might seep into iambic tetrameter, or trochaic tetrameter, or anything like that. Things where maybe it's two people that share an iambic line. So one person will have 2 feet, one person will have 3 feet. You could look at that for lyric poetry. You could look at just the fact that Othello speaks in iambic verse, whereas Iago doesn't. All these kind of things, that all comes under lyric poetry. It's a bit difficult to make a good point on unless you're talking about Iago. But you can always talk about Iago, basically. And now we'll look at Aristotle's tragic structures. And I've just realised I think I've forgotten one, so I'll put it on at the end, just using my words, if that's okay. Unless it crops up, but I don't think it does. Wrong thing. Where are you? There we go, scene 3. Hubris, excessive pride or confidence. The point is wagered arrogance. Often seen as a defiance of the gods. This is just a silly little Macbeth note because I like Macbeth. Anyway, it's the idea of Icarus, being too proud. You fly too close to the sun. I don't think anyone needs to explain that. Hubris is generally a character's fatal flaw. Not that fatal flaw is a term that's real. And then you have the peripeteia, which is the reversal of fortune, the moment where things begin to turn for the worse, where a turn is made impossible. So in Othello, you could argue it's the handkerchief scene. You could even argue it's Act 2, Scene 1, when... is it Act 2, Scene 1? Yeah, because Act 2, Scene 1 was like the last moment that Othello and Desdemona are like really in love. So you could say like after that moment, things begin to turn for the worse. You could say Act 2, Scene 3, which is probably where I'd put it, with the fight. Act 2, Scene 3, in my opinion, is a tragedy in miniature for Cassio. So, yeah, all things like that. Perite is just that reversal of fortune. And agnoresis, the moment of recognition of one's mistake, but the consequences of those mistakes within the tragedy, but it's too late to rectify them, mostly because the murder often has already been committed. So in Othello, it is literally at the very end where he's like, oh, what have I done, and then kills himself. In most tragedies it's there. If you look at it in Death of a Salesman, you have Biff's anagnoresis, which is like the Bill Oliver bit afterwards when they're in the hotel, not the hotel, the restaurant, and he's like, yeah, no, I'm a phony, we're all phonies. You sort of have the moment in Le Belle Dame sans Merci where you've got the anagnoresis of the night where he realises, oh, L for me. I could do separate things on each of the tragic things that we do if you'd like. This is just kind of poetics. But yeah. Have catharsis. This is like the most important thing, really. It's the purging of pity and fear. It kind of extends the tension and just a sense of release, though. At least in my opinion. It's required at the end of a tragedy for it to fully function, and it's often found throughout the play as well, through moments of comedy such as the porter in Macbeth, or more important to you, the clown in Othello. Penis jokes. Just release that tension. It then allows you to become more tense and allows more fear and pity to come in later if it's been a little bit relieved. And kind of tricks you. And it tricks you into feeling the dramatic irony. So, dramatic irony is just when the audience knows something that the characters do not know. It's used both to foreshadow and create a deeper sense of tragedy, as it feels like the situation could be resolved, but then, of course, it isn't. So, whether it's the fact that, we hear Cassio say, oh, I've a bad brain for drinking, or whatever, and Iago's like, nah, and then we know Cassio's going to do something bad, whether it's when Othello says, well, when I love thee not, chaos is come again, and guess what happens? Chaos is come again. All things like that. It's pretty simple, but it's everywhere in particular Shakespearean tragedy, but all tragedies, because they really require them to function. And then I think, this is the end of the slides, but I mentioned something earlier, which if I go back all the way to, I think it's really important to talk about. You have this idea of the unities of time, place, and action. Now, it's not necessarily crucial to Poetics, not to Poetics, to Othello, but I would say it is quintessential when looking at La Belle Dame sans Merci. Possibly Isabella and the Pot of Basil, maybe the Eve of St. Agnes, and the Eve of St. Agnes too, and then definitely to Death of a Salesman. But the unity of time, place, and action, the idea that a tragedy should take place over a block of 24 hours in one place and should have one singular action. That's what he says, essentially, and that will create the most tragic play. And so in Othello, of course, it takes more than just a day. If you look at La Belle Dame sans Merci, that's like one night, I'd imagine. If you look at the Eve of St. Agnes, that's one night. If you look at Death of a Salesman, that takes place over the period of 24 hours. But then you have the subversion of things. In Death of a Salesman, you've got the subversion of time. If you look at look at whatever. I don't know. If you look, I mean, I thought it subverts them all because it doesn't really take them into account. There's a thing with elements of tragedy, you kind of pick and choose. But most places in Keats, one time, one place, one action. Same with Death of a Salesman. There's one kind of action that you kind of follow. But yeah, it's just worth thinking about, worth having in there. And it's just the Aristotelian unities. I would call them the Aristotelian precepts of time, place, and action. Yeah. It's just nice. So good to just get in essays. I really recommend it. I hope this has helped. If you need anything, just let me know. And yeah, I might do more on specific things, specific bits and bobs. But yeah, hope that was helpful. Bye bye.